television host and was a leading proponent of the Brexit campaign. Mr. Lorcan Price is an attorney with ADF International, a nonprofit organization that works to protect religious freedom, free speech, parental rights, and the sanctity of life. Before joining ADF International, he was an attorney in Ireland. Mr. Morgan Reed is the president of the App Association, a trade association comprised of app developers and connected device manufacturers. He routinely testifies before Congress on matters of interest to his members, including artificial intelligence, competition, and other issues. And we have Professor David Kaye. Mr. Kaye is a clinical professor of law at the UC Irvine School of Law. Professor Kaye previously served as the United States Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you all please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You can, thank you, please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. I think we'll just go down the line, and we will start with Mr. Reed, then Mr. Price, Mr. Farage, and then Professor Kaye. So, Mr. Reed, you're recognized. 5 minutes.
My name is Morgan Reed, and I'm the president of ACT, the App Association. Our members are small and medium-sized tech companies from your districts and around the world. We build and sell the apps and the products you love. If you're scheduling a haircut, tracking your productivity at work, or using online tools to train your employees, it's likely one of my members made that happen. I'm here to tell you that our European members are just as good, just as smart, and just as entrepreneurial as our American members. Whether it's Clement Savage in France, Mitchell Volkring in the Netherlands, or Mark Thomas in the UK, their companies are busy trying to change the world. The difference between them and our American members can be seen in the ever-growing wall of ex-ante regulation and compliance requirements from an EU government that is constantly asking how government can be more involved rather than less. Unfortunately, the DMA is a perfect encapsulation of the problem. Ostensibly, it exists to make it easier for EU companies to compete with the US tech lead. Instead, it just creates leadership in red tape. Small companies find value in the bigger platforms for 3 boring and absolutely vital reasons. They need to offload overhead, have access to a global market, and have customer trust. Because small businesses are always overworked and undermanned. For us, offloading overhead is critical. A small business is trying to ship a product, not learn about tax laws in 160 countries. We don't want to sign multiple contracts with middlemen to handle shipping or web storage, or send bills to dozens of different platforms, each with their own PO system. Small businesses need to focus their time on serving the customer to compete. And of course, to grow your small business, you need customers. And that means access to a global market. If your product has fewer than 100 customers in your state, that's a hobby. But 100,000 customers worldwide, that's a business. Nearly every one of the DMA's designated gatekeepers are actually gateways to a global market. But you might say, Morgan, the internet itself is a global market. And we would agree, but the internet lacks one key characteristic: trust. Today, many of us take for granted the measures of keeping malware and other harmful content off of our devices and off of our shopping sites. But DMA threatens to change this by forcing companies to roll out the red carpet for bad actors. As a result, consumers will rationally steer away from startups and small developers they've never heard of and towards larger, more established rivals that spend millions on marketing and buy Super Bowl ads to build their brand. Don't forget who's pushing the DMA. It's companies like Spotify, Yelp, DuckDuckGo, companies you've heard of. And just in case you think I'm exaggerating, the first business to take advantage of the DMA's requirements wasn't some brilliant startup being kept down by big tech. It was an app called Hot Tub, a porn aggregator that can now be sideloaded and could even operate without parental controls. This is the most damaging aspect of the DMA. By forcing the gatekeepers to remove features or capabilities that would keep bad actors off your smartphone and out of your wallet, the DMA demands the world adopt a flea market model, where anybody with a plastic folding table and some boxes that fell off the back of the truck are given the same access to consumers as legitimate businesses. For small businesses, we want the platforms to provide us with ever-improving tools, features, and pricing models to make it attractive. We don't love the big platforms, we do business with them. Because without our products, their platforms aren't worth very much. Without their tools, our overhead goes up, our speed goes down, and trust goes out the window. If we have any ask of the platforms, it's for them to do more, not less. We want them to do more to reduce overhead, more to protect our intellectual property, and do more to maintain those trust relationships. And into this relatively straightforward business arrangement, Europe has injected regulatory walls like the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Online Safety Act, our old friend GDPR, and the newest edition, the AI Act. These laws aren't there to lower friction. They are, as Teresa Ribera at the European Commission puts it, focused on creating a culture of compliance. That's a quote. While an ever-thickening wall of overlapping regulations is exactly what compliance lawyers want, it's not what innovators want. It's not what small businesses want, and it's not what customers want. We ask you to reject the European regulatory culture and instead focus on a culture of opportunity and innovation. Small businesses never succeed if we can't beat the red tape. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Mr. Price, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Raskin, distinguished members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lorcan Price. I am a barrister and legal counsel for ADF International, and I'm very happy to come here today to speak to you about the perilous situation for freedom of expression in Europe and why it matters for Americans. I do this on the basis of my experience litigating in speech and religious liberty cases before the European Court of Human Rights. However, today, principally, I wish to address the Digital Services Act of the European Union. But before I do that, I'd like to set the scene briefly by telling you how bad things have become in Europe and the United Kingdom, and very much building on the remarks of the chairman. Because when I met some of the members of the committee in Europe recently, I think that there was a genuine element of surprise and disbelief about the state of affairs in Europe. I'll give you some examples. In Finland, our client, Päivi Räsänen, a member of parliament, is now in year 5 of a prosecution for simply posting a verse from scripture on Twitter. Our client, Rose Doherty in Scotland, a 74-year-old grandmother, was arrested by offering to have consensual conversations for people. Adam Smith-Connor, an army veteran, was prosecuted for praying silently in his head in England. And just yesterday, you'll have seen that the UK police arrested a comedian and fellow Irishman, Graham Linehan, a person I know well, for tweets about gender ideology. German pensioners are having their homes raided and are being prosecuted for insulting politicians. Indeed, one member of the Green Party in Germany has over 700 criminal complaints outstanding for insult. What's happening in Europe is, as Vice President Vance said on St. Valentine's Day in Munich, a serious retreat from a fundamental value, that of free speech. It's a sign that our European political elite has lost control of the narrative, and the Digital Services Act is the response to that, an increasingly desperate attempt to suppress growing public discontent. Why should this matter for Americans? Why should you be concerned? Because of the worldwide reach of European law, the so-called Brussels effect changes regulation in every area that the European Union chooses to regulate. And now they've entered the business of regulating speech. And they're very proud of the so-called Brussels effect when you ask them about it. This new EU law is essentially an anti-speech law. And when you read the case law of the European Court of Justice, statements from senior officials, and the provisions of the Digital Services Act, you can see everything is there to create a digital censorship industrial complex. We see a whole structure of trusted flaggers, codes of conduct on so-called hate speech and misinformation, content moderation for so-called systemic risks. Much of this is hidden in bland technocratic language in the DSA, and our written submissions go into some of the problems associated with it. But it constitutes nothing more than an attempt to bring Brussels regulation of speech onto a global stage. Furthermore, when the European Union is now negotiating trade deals, including with your neighbours to the north and Canada, they insist that the Digital Services Act is part of that. So it's very clearly a global intent. It means that the European Union will set the global standard when it comes to speech. And because of the laws that I just outlined in Europe, the type of prosecutions we're seeing, it's an extremely low standard. It draws, I would suggest to you, a digital curtain where once there was an iron curtain. And US companies bear the brunt disproportionately of this. They're hijacked by the DSA to become essentially the EU's global censorship police, whether they like it or not. The DSA contains expansive powers of investigation, huge compliance costs, and crippling fines if they're found to be non-compliant for removing so-called illegal content. Indeed, I commend your committee's report recently on showing the bias at the heart of the system. As we speak, companies are having to make a decision, an invidious decision between whether or not they defend German pensioners criticising politicians or they comply with the European Commission and with national laws. We know from COVID censorship which is the most likely route they take. Compliance is easier and cheaper, but it is not good for speech. Indeed, yesterday I was just informed by a senior lawyer for a major US company that the Germans are prosecuting a 14-year-old boy for a mild online post. They want the identity of another post outside Germany, and they've launched criminal proceedings against US employees of this company for refusing to pass over the identity information. That's the attitude we're dealing with. We've seen it from Thierry Breton, from others in the European Commission. They want this censorship power and they want it globally. The digital square is one of the great gifts from the United States to the world. It has been transformative for our political discussion. But the EU wants to make itself the sheriff of the square, and it's armed itself with powerful tools. And there are more to come, unfortunately, including the Democracy Shield. I agree with Ranking Member Raskin that it is sad when close allies and democracies do this kind of thing, and we must call them out for it. We must take a stand against this new censorship wave. Democracy requires free speech. I'm looking forward to our discussion and any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Price. The Right Honourable Member of Parliament, Mr. Farage, is recognized.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chairman Jordan, for inviting me here today. And it turns out, with news in the last 48 hours, to have been really rather timely. I'm delighted to reacquaint with the charming Mr. Raskin. That was a delightful testimony you gave me earlier on with your speech. But hey, that's fine. You can say what you like. I don't care. Because that's what free speech is. And in a sense, this has all been going wrong now for a couple of decades. We've kind of forgotten the Voltairean principles that we'll fight and defend to the death your right to say something that we fundamentally disagree with. That is the absolute foundation, if you think about it, of free speech, of democracy, of living in freedom. It's kind of why we fought 2 world wars at massive, massive cost to defend that very principle for ourselves and for many, many others around the country. And I first became worried about all this with cancel culture. You know, the idea that we can't have this speaker go to a university because some people might be offended by what he or she have to say. It is important to note that there is not a parent in the United Kingdom, and I would guess it's the same for America too, that is not concerned about content their children as minors can find on the internet. Not a single parent that is not concerned about this. But at the moment, we're not finding the right solutions. I do myself begin to think that hardware might be one of the solutions. That laptops, that handsets could be programmed so that many, many apps and many, many services simply aren't available from these devices. But what we've done is to go down the legislative route. And it's extraordinary that, you know, I come from the land of Magna Carta, I come from the land that gave us the mother of parliaments, and it doesn't give me any great joy to be sitting in America and describing the really awful authoritarian situation that we have now sunk into. J.D. Vance did us all a service at the Munich Security Conference back in February this year. He really got this debate up and running, and it's a vital one. We've run on since then. The Online Safety Act was put in place by the last Conservative government. I don't doubt for a minute they're good intentions, but sometimes the road to hell is paved with those good intentions. And we are now where we are. We have a couple of very famous cases. We, of course, have Lucy Connolly, who put out an intemperate tweet after the savage murder of those 3 beautiful young girls, she herself, a mother who had lost a child. It was intemperate, it was wrong, but she removed it 3.5 hours later, sentenced to 31 months in prison. She's now out, having served 40% of the time. I wanted to bring her with me today as living proof of what can go wrong. Sadly, the restrictions that have been put on her banned her from making the trip, which is a very, very great shame. And we, of course, have the extraordinary events that we understood yesterday of Graham Linehan, the comedic writer, and he put out some tweets months ago when he was in Arizona, and months later he arrives at Heathrow Airport to be met by 5 armed police. Armed police, not a big deal in the USA, a very big deal in the United Kingdom. 5 of them. And he was arrested and taken away for questioning. He's not even a British citizen. He's an Irish citizen. This could happen to any American man or woman that goes to Heathrow that has said things online that the British government and British police don't like. It is a potentially big threat to tech bosses, to many, many others. This legislation we've got will damage trade between our countries, threaten free speech across the West because of the knock-on rollout effects of this legislation from us or from the European Union. So I've come today as well to be a klaxon, to say to you, don't allow, piece by piece, this to happen here in America. And you would be doing us and yourselves and all freedom-loving people a favor if your politicians and your businesses said to the British government, you've simply got this wrong. At what point did we become North Korea? Well, I think the Irish comedy writer found that out 2 days ago at Heathrow Airport. This is a genuinely worrying, concerning, and shocking situation, and I thank you for the opportunity to come here today.
Thank you, Mr. Well said. Thank you, Mr. Farage. Professor Kaye, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Raskin, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you. I ask that my written statement be entered into the record. My name is David Kaye. I'm a law professor at the University of California, Irvine, where I research and teach in international law. I know something about censorship. From 2014 to 2020, I was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. In that role, I monitored a growing global assault on free speech. Among other things, I led a landmark effort to call out China's attacks on civil society. I detailed repression of media and criticism in Putin's Russia. I condemned Iran's suppression of dissent. And I even criticized democratic governments when they sought to force platforms to take down lawful speech. That is censorship. Violations of the human right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, guaranteed by Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a treaty ratified by the United States in 1992. Inspired by the First Amendment, it guarantees a speaker's rights and the rights of everyone to access information. So it pains me that the United States, the country that had my back as Special Rapporteur, the land of the First Amendment's make no law, now leads the charge to undermine freedom of speech and of the press. The threat is real, live, and I think shocking given our nation's historic commitments. The administration follows a well-worn path. A few examples. The silencing of scientists and public health officials. Just last week, the head of the CDC was fired because she would not agree to change her conclusions about vaccines. The administration has scrubbed websites that doctors and parents use to make decisions. Censoring and punishing speech of visitors. In visa interviews and at the border, there are increasing reports of officers screening visitors according to their social media activity or detaining and deporting based on speech and op-eds. And the repeated assaults on the media, as we've seen attacks on public broadcasting, frivolous lawsuits against media outlets, and the decimation of Voice of America. This is the tip of an iceberg of censorship that should concern this committee and every American. Yet US officials who claim to be free speech warriors are spending their time looking abroad. Now, I know of nobody who argues that EU and British laws on speech are perfect. Still, the EU Digital Services Act and the UK Online Safety Act respond to problems both sides of the aisle in Congress have found serious but have yet to address. The enormous, opaque, and unaccountable power of a small number of massive tech companies over our information environments. The EU answered the question of massive platform power not by claiming new powers to take down content or accounts. It adopted new rules to empower users, including by requiring notice and an opportunity to appeal content moderation decisions. The Online Safety Act, championed by Labor and conservative parties, was widely popular as an attempt to hold big tech accountable. It does have elements that concern me, yet whatever faults it might have, it, like any other British law, is subject to legal challenge and review by courts for any violation of fundamental rights, just as we would expect of any democracy. Neither established censorship regimes. I encourage members of this committee to consider two things. First, instead of criticizing allied democracies, consider the kinds of content online that you find objectionable. Maybe it's anti-Semitic or Islamophobic content, misogyny, child endangerment, content glorifying terrorism or inciting violence. How do you propose to address those in a way that is consistent with free speech values? That's not an easy question, and it can't be waved away with just 3 words, because free speech. The EU and the UK have made their choices, subject to democratic judicial oversight, and acting in good faith. I think this committee could do the same. Second, this committee has the obligation to protect Americans' freedom of expression here at home. The administration is putting freedom of expression under direct attack, and I think oversight and constraint from this committee would make quite a bit of sense. That, I would respectfully submit, is the real threat to American speech and innovation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. The chair, we'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan. Well, one of the things we found out on our trip through Europe was that the U.S. innovates, China duplicates, and now the EU regulates. Mr. Reid, I have a question for you first. Reports estimate that complying with the EU's Digital Markets Act, the DMA, could cost American companies up to $1 billion every single year. That's not just a number on a page. Those costs ultimately fall on American workers, who will see fewer jobs, on consumers, who will face higher prices and fewer choices, and on entrepreneurs, who will have a harder time competing against subsidized foreign rivals. Mr. Reid, is it correct that these compliance costs affect our economy? And what does it mean for America if Europe is allowed to impose these kind of costs on U.S. innovation?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. The more detailed answer is that, unfortunately, Europe has taken an ex-ante approach to regulation. The United States has always done well with an ex post. As a small business entrepreneur, I actually want fraud to be gone after. I want deceptive practices to be reduced. But unfortunately, what we see in the EU is an ex-ante process that ups my compliance requirements without actually giving customers the certainty of the result. So it's absolutely raising costs, and for American developers, we see one of the largest problems is how do you get to those European customers if the first tranche you hit is paying a compliance lawyer to meet all of these tests?
Thank you. Mr. Price, our Federal Trade Commission Chairman Ferguson has warned the government regulation can stifle, obviously, competition and innovation, and in many cases, the government itself becomes the most dangerous of all the monopolies. Isn't it the DMA, is the DMA a perfect example of that? It kind of weaponizes and makes it burdensome with regulations. Can you give me your comments on the DMA and what do you think the status is right now?
I certainly agree that European regulation generally slows down competition. It creates a situation whereby companies are unable to innovate with any degree of speed because they're constantly looking over their shoulder towards regulators around compliance. DMA, a very good example of that. Not just the DMA, though. Of course, you have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. You have the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and constantly more and more being added. It's been estimated in the digital market space alone since 2016. 30 pages of regulation existed at the time. We're now over 1,000 and growing. So the European Union's response to American innovation is more and more regulation, generally around nebulous concepts like safetyism and protecting consumers, but very often just, particularly with the DSA, to create, unfortunately, a censorship industrial complex, as I outlined. DMA, very good example of that as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reid, if I could come back to you, President Trump just secured a landmark commitment from the EU to address unjustified digital trade barriers. It was part of the U.S.-EU trade deal. I'm hopeful that this will result in the EU kind of removing, and a lot of people we talked to in Europe when we were there said that there was a possibility that they could pull back on some of this. What action could President Trump take to hold the EU accountable to their commitment? And are there additional enforcement tools that Congress could provide to make that happen?
Well, I think, Congressman Fitzgerald, you've done great work in reaching out and sending letters to make it clear what the position of the United States government is on these issues. The reality is that the Europeans themselves, through the Draghi report, are recognizing that they have done a lot to harm those very same industries. We're hopeful that the United States can continue to use the careful power and the careful discussions through our trade negotiations and other actions to get them to step back. But we're here to talk about free speech, and so one of the things I would point out is we want the small businesses in Europe to also be able to speak and say, hey, we need these regulations pulled back.
So just to follow up to that then as well, a 2024 staff report by the Housing Oversight Committee found that FTC Chair Linehan was using taxpayer dollars to send agency quote-unquote liaisons to the EU to assist with the implementation of the Digital Markets Act. Mr. Reed, do you think it's appropriate for that type of consultation or for the use of taxpayer dollars to help a foreign country implement laws that unfairly discriminate against U.S. companies?
Well, we don't think taxpayer dollars should ever be used to unfairly discriminate against United States companies. We're hopeful that U.S. taxpayer dollars can be used to ensure open markets around the world and a safe environment for our entrepreneurs to succeed.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the subcommittee, or ranking member of the subcommittee, gentleman who made a big announcement this week. We're sorry to hear about, but we appreciate your service, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, there is a clear and present danger to free speech in America, but it is not across the Atlantic Ocean. It is right here in Washington, sitting in the Oval Office. At a time when the greatest threat to the First Amendment rights of Americans resides in the White House, our Republican colleagues have brought us here today to talk about Europe. They've invited a fringe politician from the United Kingdom to attack the laws regulating certain conduct online in his country and the European Union, laws that are intended to combat disinformation by hostile foreign actors, hate speech, and other fraudulent or criminal conduct. They have sounded the alarms about these foreign laws, but when it comes to the Trump administration's suppression of speech in this country, Republicans are curiously and dangerously silent. There is virtually no corner of society that Donald Trump and his administration have left untouched by their effort to impose their radical views on the American people and to stamp out dissent. Since taking office, President Trump and members of his administration have used the powers of the executive branch in an attempt to silence their political opponents by attacking our core democratic institutions, such as academia, the legal profession, and journalism. These are moves straight out of the authoritarian playbook. For example, the Trump administration has taken aim at colleges and universities, trying to bend them to its will by withholding billions of dollars in scientific research funding, a short-sighted move that will set back innovation in this country by decades. And in some cases, including at my alma mater of Columbia, it has demanded onerous conditions that infringe on academic freedom. On these same college campuses, students are being kidnapped for writing op-eds, and others are being deported for participating in protests. The Trump administration has also targeted disfavored law firms that dare to challenge the president or to hold him accountable, or simply for hiring an attorney who clashed with Trump in the past. Some have sadly capitulated to its campaign of extortion. The president has even taken aim at the arts and humanities, launching a hostile takeover of the Kennedy Center and censoring exhibits at the Smithsonian Institution, attempting to whitewash American history and to stamp out free expression. He has also engaged in a dangerous campaign of harassment and intimidation of the media. For example, last October, he sued CBS for $10 billion for editing a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris in a way he didn't like. Although this suit was widely ridiculed by First Amendment attorneys who called it meritless and absurd, Paramount, the parent company of CBS News, was desperate to win approval from the Trump-controlled FCC for its proposed multi-billion-dollar merger and felt pressure to settle this baseless lawsuit. Ultimately, it paid $16 million to settle the suit, and just days later, the FCC approved the merger. What a coincidence. This followed ABC's settlement of a similarly baseless Trump lawsuit for $15 million because of corporate pressure. And now the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch face their own $10 billion lawsuit from Donald Trump over the Journal's reporting that shed new light on Trump's well-documented relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not aware of any president in the past suing media companies or newspapers or television stations for free expression they didn't like. Professor Kaye, the free press is essential to our democracy and the rule of law. Can you explain how President Trump's attacks on the news media and his attempts to sue them into silence impact freedom of expression and freedom of speech in this country?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Nadler, and congratulations on your announcement this week. Well, I think it's important to note that when we're talking about attacks on the press, it's not just about attacks on the journalists themselves or the media outlets themselves. It's about every American's right of access to information. It's about the freedom of public debate that we get from a media that isn't intimidated either by suit or by criticism from the Oval Office or whatever it might be. And so I think it's really important to think about these kinds of attacks, not only as those on journalists, but on the entire information ecosystem. And I think it's also important for us to realize that we can't pick and choose what censorship we like and don't like. I think the chairman's statement was really correct when he said censorship used by people in power to censor critics, that's at the core. And we should be examining where do we see that. We tend to see that quite a bit in this country, I think in an unprecedented way.
In your testimony, you identified a number of threats to freedom of expression in the United States, including science and public health. It's also been reported that the government has a list of hundreds of words, ranging from issues related to climate change to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it essentially is banned from government websites and users to make funding decisions. Is this true?
I've seen those reports, and I understand that to be true as well, particularly the use of lists of words, essentially to censor research that would be conducted by scientists at universities and at national academies in the United States.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member is recognized for unanimous consent. Understand?
Yes.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman. This is a minority fact sheet about the majority's report on the Digital Services Act.
Well, we'll look forward to reading that. Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I have another.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for unanimous consent.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article published by Reuters on October 29th, 2024, titled Fact Check, UK Woman Jailed for Inciting Racial Hatred, Not Posting Hurtful Words, which confirms that Lucy Connolly pled guilty to inciting racial hatred and was not, as claimed in deceptive social media posts, punished merely for posting, quote, edgy words on the internet.
Without objection. I'm sure we'll
Thank
be
you, Mr.
some
Chairman.
comments about that later. And the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Kaye, being a fellow Californian, I'm sure you're aware and could correct the ranking member that our own governor has sued Fox for $787 million